Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tutorial 11. I'm kind of squeezed in here because I've got my camera up here, so I'm going to switch between scenes, but I thought I could talk to you first, and then I'll switch to the keyboard so you can see a little bit better what my hands are doing, because tonight is going to be a little bit more complicated tutorial. We're going to be playing some relatively rich, thick chords, and the transitions between those chords are going to be a little bit difficult to describe and to internalize for you. But what I'm trying to do in this tutorial is to give you another style of improvisation that is, in this case, is not piano. Strings and voices are very different in terms of their tonality. And strings in the keyboards, when you hold the strings down, it's like an orchestral playing the strings legato, and until you let off the notes, they just play. Whereas when you play a piano, you strike the piano keys and it simulates a piano, which decays over time. So in strings and voice playing, you typically don't do as many arpeggiations. You don't have to repeat notes that much, but instead you get interesting texture and sounds by doing transitions differently and using more dissonance and so forth. And so it's a very different style of playing. Tonight we're going to use the same A minor scale and some of the A minor chords that we talked about in tutorial 10, but I'm going to change those up and add some new chords that are very different. It creates a completely different tonality than tutorial 10. It's more melancholy, more soft and reflective music. So right now I've got the keyboard set up on strings here on my Fantom. I'm going to try to switch over to the Korg occasionally when I get done kind of going through the lesson. But right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the chords with you, and I'm going to go through some of the tools to add to your toolkit when you're playing with strings and voices. Again, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to look at the chords and play along. So take your time. I'm going to go slow, and I'd really recommend playing along with me with your keyboard and watching what I'm doing and trying to emulate the chords I'm playing and how I'm playing those chords, and start to internalize those so you can play them when you're sitting down just improvising. The key again is taking some time every day to learn these chords, learn the transitional notes I'm going to share with you, and just play around and see what sounds good to you. So that's, in my mind, the best way to learn how to do improvisation. I'm going to talk about chords in the normal kind of phrasing, basically talking about the keys in the chords. At some point in time, maybe in a later tutorial, we'll start getting into talking about chords a little differently and talk about intervals and talking about what individual chords actually are in music theory. But I don't want to add too much complexity to it. I'd rather you sit down and play, get comfortable with one scale, which we're working on the A minor scale, and that way you can continue to build tools in that scale and complements of different techniques you can use to play. And as we get more sophisticated later on, you could be able to transition those tools to other scales on the keyboard. Okay? So I'm going to switch over to the camera one here. and I'm going to be playing on this keyboard. And tonight we're going to play the A minor scale. Now, last time we played G major and D major. So we used the chords A minor, G major, and D major. Tonight, we're going to add some other things. We also, by the way, we used F major and G major again. And we also used C major last time. So I'm not gonna. I'm assuming that you guys, if you're not familiar with those chords, go back to tutorial 10 and listen to those a couple times and get those chords down. But now tonight I'm going to start with an A minor with a second inversion on the A. So again, inversions. This is the root position with A minor, which is A, C, E, and then the first inversion is C, E, A, and the second inversion is E, A, C, and that's where I'm going to start. Now, the first chord I want you to know besides A minor is E major. E major is E, G sharp, B. And an E in the left hand. And then from the E major chord, we're going to go to a D minor chord, not D major, but D minor. The difference between D major and D minor is one note. It's the D minor chord is D, F, natural A, not F sharp. So that's how it sounds. Hear that? Okay. And again, just like we did on tutorial 10, you can change inversions, you can go up the keyboard. So right away when you're playing those three chords, you can add variation by, instead of going down like I did the first time, you can go up and play those same keys in different inversions or and different octaves. Okay, so then what I'd like to suggest you do next is to really add texture and motion into your improv. Now I want you to go in and start to play transition notes. So, in other words, when you go to the E major chord, instead of going straight to E major, which is this chord, I want you to play an A minor, so E, A, B. So you hear there's like a dissonance there. So it's like it has to resolve to E major. So right there there's transition notes. I'm going to introduce in each transition from one chord to the next. What I'm doing is I'm keeping one or two notes from the previous chord in my second chord when I play it, and then I resolve it to the full second chord afterward. So here's what it sounds like. So notice I'm going to go to E major would be this, but A minor is this. So instead I'm going to go to the E major, but I'm going to keep my middle finger on the A. And then go to the G sharp. Now I'm there. Now I'm going to go. That was not in the same, but that works. So There's many ways to do it, but the concept is that when I go to the next chord, I'm not going fully to that chord. I'm having one of the notes or two of the notes still stay on the other chord. So now I just went straight to the D, but now when I go to the E major to go to the next chord, you'll notice I'm going to go to the E major, but stay there with, again, the A to the G sharp. Now I'm going to go to the G major chord. Now, so you notice I've just embellished every one of those with a little bit of a transition note, and there's a dissonance there. But now I'm going to go from an F major chord now, and instead of going to a D minor completely, I'm going to go to an F major, and then I'm going to go to a D minor, but I'm going to go from a C to a B. Hear that difference instead of like this? Okay. It's a 6 note. So basically you're going from a okay. The concept is you're playing with the strings or the voices. You're doing a lot of that tension between the different chords you're playing, and you're adding texture to the chords. We can talk about what those chords are in a more advanced session of the tutorial, but right now it's really just kind of playing notes within the chord you're going to from the prior chord you played first. So, and the other thing you can do to add some variations is play in the bass, not your fundamental of the chord. So right here I'm playing an A minor chord, but in my left hand I'm playing a bass note E. Very different than this sound. That's like a final resolution of A minor, but this, you know, something else is coming. Okay, so let's go through that again. Really, we'll do a couple other variations. So now the other thing I'm doing here is going from the D minor. I was going from this. This is another chord. This, instead of the D minor chord, you're playing the D minor, but you're adding in a C instead. So you're actually playing an F chord here with a D on the bass. That's really a D7, but D minor. But you're basically just adding a C instead of a D. But you can hear it adds more than just this. And then when I'm going to go to the E major chord now from the D minor chord, I'm going to play the E major chord with the A on the right, the A, which is the transition note to the G sharp, which that's the full E major chord there. So like we're doing, but instead of the left hand going to the E, I'm going to stay on the D. So here's what that sounds like. Right, so that also adds tension in the sound. It's a E major chord. Again, I'm using the, I'm going from an A to a G sharp, but I'm staying on the D here. So I went from a D minor with the C on my right hand, and then I'm going to an E major on my right hand with an A at the top, but I'm staying on the D for the bass. Now I'm going to go down to an A minor, but I'm going to play a C for the bass in the A minor, and instead here's another tension. Now listen to that chord. Isn't that just really rich? I've got actually two notes together. I'm playing a C down here, but I'm playing a B here. Usually that sounds pretty crazy, but when you split it out on the keyboard, it really adds some deep beauty to the sound. And then again, you resolve right to the A minor. And now I'm going to this is again, believe it or not, this is an E major chord with a D, which is an E major 7th, but I won't get into that. I'll just say it's an E major with an A, B, D on the right hand, and a B in the bass. Now, when I resolve, I still am going to keep the D here, but I'm going to go from a B bass to an E, and then I'm going to go on my right hand from an A, B, D to a G sharp, B, D. So, and then I'm going to go down. And now, this is another really cool sound. I've got an F on my bass, and I'm playing an E, A, C. Instead of an F, I'm playing close to an F major scale, or F major chord, but I'm moving from an F to an E. Again, these are chords that are a little richer texture, and they add dissonance and thickness to the music. So, especially when you're playing chords, strings, and choir, it really can add a lot. So. Now I'm going to go down again to the D and go from a C to B. And then I'm going to switch over to an E major chord, but I'm just moving one note. I'm going from the F to the E here, keeping my pinky here on the A at first. And I'm going to stay on the D as the bass. Now I'm going down to an A minor chord with a C in the bass. And I'm resolving from a D to a C. So now I'm straight on an A minor chord with a C bass. Now I'm down to the E major. So part of this is playing around with some of these transition notes and chords that are not exactly E major or E minor. They're actually close to it. Okay, so when you start out, you can be playing one progression, and again, you're going from A minor. The main progression is to an E major, to a D minor, to an E major, and to an F, to a D minor, to an E major, to an A minor. But you can switch it up. Once you know those chords, there's so many things you can do. You could even try embellishing it with other chords that from some of the other improvs that we've talked about. You can add chords and see whether they fit. Maybe they will have just slightly different transitions and so forth. You can also do the E minor instead of an E major. So there, right there, see that's a very different sound with just one change. From E major is going to E minor. And then back to E major. So it just changes up the music with just one chord change. So that's why I'm suggesting play around with all the chords from this session and tutorial 10, and because you can also do that. So you can use a D major chord too, but then you can go back and then sometimes I resolve to an A major when I'm done with the improv. Right? A lot of times, a lot of classical music does that too. So again, what I'm going to suggest is you're going to probably have to turn this tutorial on, get used to playing those chords and those transitions, and then get used to playing some of the chords that with the tension in with different transitional notes. And you can also do transition notes before you go to the next chord. So like right here, there's a D minor, but I'm getting ready to go to an A minor chord. So I'm actually doing a transitional note before I change my primary chord. Okay. So, the chords you want to be working with this week, if you're following along, it's like A minor, E major, D minor, E major, F major, D major with a seventh, or I'm sorry, not sixth, a B in the chord, and then an E major to an A minor. That's one approach. But again, you can change this up. You can go to an E minor first. To a D major. It's just so fun to play with chords as you start to memorize those and then say, well, let's see, I'm going to try to do a major versus a minor here, and then I'm going to switch it around. And so many times you find that you gravitate towards a particular sequence of chords, and then if you start to use those chords more often, you just add those to your toolkit. And it's always fun to change up a chord progression with a unique variation, and it kind of gets your audience and yourself in a different frame of mind with just one chord change, okay? So I'm going to finish up tonight. I'm going to switch to the other camera, and I'm going to do an short improv with strings. I'm going to play choir. And the choir is going to go over on my Korg keyboard here. And I've got choir on both of these too. But I will go ahead and we'll see where this goes. But these are the same chord progressions we talked about and very similar transition notes, okay? one other thing, and then I'll close for the night. But I'm going to switch over here because I was doing something that's kind of unique. I was playing some more dissonant chords together. So one of the things that's really kind of cool is I played an F major chord on the right hand. So you see that, you kind of go to, that's a really dissonant chord because you're playing an E and an F together, right half tone. But when I'm playing it in the bass, and then I go up to a G major, so I'm starting with an F major chord with an E bass, and then a G major chord with an E bass, and then resolving to the E major chord. And then here's another one. You can also play the D minor chord with an E in the bass. So you can play around with that tool as well. So you can sit there and here I'm going to play up here. And just have fun with it. And then there's a D minor chord, and then an A minor chord, and then an E major chord. So a lot of times, especially with pipe organ, you play a fundamental note on the bass pedal and you just hold it, and that gets held. So I'm going to play that on my Korg over there, and now I'm just going to keep that E as the foundation of the music, and now I'm just going to play around with the chords, with the E major to an F major to a G major to an E major and then I can go to an A minor, and again I'm now got tension because I haven't resolved fully to the E major. I've got an A here. All right, so that's another technique you can do to add some variations on a theme. But that is kind of the first tutorial on strings and choir and building kind of a Gothic classical sound, melancholy, and what you'd hear in an orchestra requiem or something like that. So, okay. Hope that was useful. I know we went through a lot of chords and a lot of progressions. Sorry if it's complicated. If you'd like me to go through it in more detail or slower, let me know in the comments, and I will go ahead and add another tutorial to augment what we did tonight. But I think if you play it over and work on, 30, 40 minutes a day, sitting down, working on those chords and playing in a sustained tone like strings and choir, you'll get the hang of it over time, and it'll start getting really fun creating these dissonant chords and then resolving them, and then working on differences of major and minor chords and changing up the progressions. Okay, take care, God bless, and we'll see you next time.